So, the last two episodes of Mushoku Tensei Season 2 happened, and it caused quite the storm on the internet. They were an emotional bunch of episodes, and tensions have been high in the anime community, with a lot of knee-jerk reactions and well-thought-out reactions both for and against what this anime had to say and portray. I myself was deeply moved by the series, but I ultimately decided I wanted to sort out my thoughts for a while before weighing in with my own opinion on the matter. Not that anyone in the grand scheme of things is going to listen to little old 130 subscriber single video me over here. But that's fine. This channel is a way for me to document my thoughts and share them with the people I want to share them with. And if I see growth at the same time, so be it. This is a complicated situation, and I would like to be forward when I say that I don't know if I have the right answer. I think it's too complex for such a thing to exist, and that anyone who says they know for a fact what is right and wrong in this situation is missing something. Surely I'm missing something and haven't thought about it from every single angle either, but I don't care. I've done enough thinking, and this video is to share my own thoughts on the matter, even if it'll accomplish nothing. I'm not going over the events of the anime. Anyone who's clicked on this video has already seen the episodes in question or has seen other videos about them. This video will be nobody's introduction to what we are going to be talking about today, so I'm not going to treat it as such. I will say going into this, I have read all the light novels of Mushoku Tensei, and I love the series. I could be potentially biased in its favor. It's one that I derive a huge amount of meaning from and will remember for the rest of my life. I know what hits the cutting room floor, and I want to do my best to keep everything in mind. I have always been a person who believes that a medium should stand on its own right and not require the original source material in order to provide extra context. That an adaptation should be able to stand on its own. As it happens, I saw 11 prior to reading that point in the light novels, and saw episode 12 after reading that point in the light novels, as I was reading at the same time I was watching the series. It is certainly true that there were some important stuff left out, like Rudy having been starving himself in his room without talking to anybody for well over a week by the time Roxy came in. However, while it's not explicit about the details, this was something I assumed on my own based on the presentation of the anime when I first saw it, upon seeing Rudy's sunken cheeks, that it had been a long time and that he hadn't been eating. The anime perhaps could have thrown in just a single line along the lines of, "It's been 9 days and he still won't talk to us. I don't know what to do." And that could have helped its cause, but the specifics don't matter, and it's something that can be construed as long as you're paying close attention to what the show is trying to show you. Like I said, I figured out pretty much everything without the specific details, without having read the books at the time. Now, let's talk about it. One could argue that Mushoku Tensei is about redemption. And it is, in a way. But I don't think it's redemption of a character, redemption of a bad person going to a good person. What it actually is a redemption of a character's history. To Rudy, what needs to be redeemed is not who he was as a person, but what he did with his previous life, and specifically how he wasted it. This is clear from the very first episode. The last line in episode 1 is Rudy thinking that maybe even someone like him can use his do-over not to become a better person, but to live seriously. The theme of Mushoku Tensei is to live life in a way where you won't have regrets with whatever hand you're dealt. This is the central theme in episode 1, and it is the central theme in the last lines of the light novels as well. By sheer coincidence, in his quest to fulfill his promise to himself, he grows, changes, and becomes a better person in many ways. And a secondary theme of the show is that anybody is capable of change if it's something that you want and are willing to work towards yourself. The show makes repeated examples throughout its run that Rudy's change is very rarely comes from an outside force telling him he did something wrong, and more from an internal desire to do right and change. For example, in episode 6 of season 1, he gropes and assaults Eris while she sleeps. And yes, he is beat by Eris for it, but he faces no other consequences for that and sees the beating as an acceptable cost for what he got out of it. During that time, he is in an environment where nobody will say anything about what he did, and he will receive no repercussions. Eris's dad is already receptive to the idea of pairing them together. Eris's granddad does plenty of worse things himself. Eris herself is used to Rudy's behavior, and everyone else who may not see Rudy's actions in a positive light write them off because either A, he's a gray rat and Paul's son, so it's to be expected, or B, they've seen and heard way worse and more perverse things at the royal capital in Asura, so they don't see it as a big deal. Rudy's change of mind when he starts to give Eris more space and start growing a real respect for her comes after Ghislaine came close to telling Rudy a story about when she was assaulted by Paul, his father, a person she relates to a wolf ambushing her at night after having given Eris a ring to protect her from just such a thing. Rudy himself takes his first step towards being a better person upon seeing the ring and wand that he and Ghislaine gave to Eris as gifts. He sees the ring and is forced to think about Paul and whether he wants to do the same things his father did, and sees the wand and how happy Eris was upon receiving the gifts, and decides on his own that he would regret doing something to her that would cross a line or make her unhappy. This change was an internal one, and brought about by his decisions upon seeing the world around him, not an external force telling him that he needs to do better and be different. This is how most of Rudy's character growth happens throughout the series, but this is my favorite example of it. This is important because it means that what defines right and wrong is unclear, and Rudy will only make changes based on his own sense of morality as it evolves and changes throughout the story. Does this mean that we should set aside our own sense of morality and only focus on the context of the story, Rudy's character, and what the world in the story sees as right and wrong, and only view it from that lens? No, not at all. Stories are read by real people, and as such will be viewed by real people with a real sense of modern morality, and this is natural and shouldn't be changed. It's possible to accept actions taken by a character and know they may or may not be justified in the context of their own world, but still condemn them by the moralities and laws of our own. Both should be taken into account, not just one over the other. I believe that one should meet halfway and understand that the decisions made in the context of the story and accept them, but also not lose sight of our own modern view of right and wrong, and still view it through that lens. It should also be noted that growth is not linear, and people stumble and make mistakes, and that Rudy's journey won't ever be finished until the whole series is complete. That should also not stop us from being upset or calling characters out on their shit when they do wrong. I fully understand why a lot of people never make it past episode 6 of this show, and I don't blame them for it. Regardless of how amazing the writing is for this show, it has to come with a content warning when you tell people to watch it, because it's not something everybody is going to be comfortable experiencing. There is a difference between watching sexual assault happen on screen and watching the main character do it, receive no punishment for it, and only getting his side of the internal monologue. This is what makes people uncomfortable with the show, despite its incredible writing. And it's only fair that we acknowledge that this is what turns people off of the show more than the acts themselves. Plenty of shows depict far worse and more decrepit things than Rudy ever does. It's because we only get things from Rudy's perspective and the world at large isn't against him that make people uncomfortable during the beginning portions, especially in this series. Now, let's finally examine and discuss episode 23 of Season 2, the focal points of the controversy and the mixed feelings in the community. There are 3 major parties involved in what happened who have varying levels of faults: Rudy, Roxy, and Elena-Lise. Sylvie, I think, should be addressed separately, and also in the context of Rudy in this discussion, because she is obviously not anywhere in any level at fault. I'm not exactly sure where the best point to start is, but I find it easiest to sort my thoughts by asking questions and answering them, so let's do that. Keep in mind that the answer to all these questions is my own personal opinion on the matter. Question 1. Is Rudy at fault for cheating on Sylvie? No, I don't think so. In this context, there is a clear understanding from every party that what Roxy did was taking advantage and essentially sexual assault. Rudy was severely depressed and in a vulnerable mental state after having starved himself and shut himself in his room for 2 weeks, completely racked with suicidal levels of depression. Whatever actions he reciprocated with Roxy, and whatever he did, he was not in a place mentally to, in good faith and soundness of mind, give consent to Roxy. Question 2. Was Roxy making a move on Rudy something that saved his life? This is something that we will never have the answer to completely. Regardless of whether it was possible for something else to break Rudy out of his current headspace, Roxy did it, and at the very least, while not curing his depression or sadness over losing his father, got him to at least move forward and address it, and to think about what comes next. It is safe to say that this is something Roxy achieved. Whether the path Rudy was on would truly result in his death, or if he would eventually start moving on his own, is something that we can't say for sure, so I'm not sure we can say anything as grand as Roxy saved Rudy's life. But it can definitely be said that Roxy saved him in some capacity. Question 3. Regardless of any ulterior motives Roxy had, does saving Rudy justify the actions she took? This is something I personally don't have the answer to. The closest I can give to a concrete answer is probably no, but it's complicated. Something true in the series is that because of an abundance relying on healing magic, medical knowledge, including issues of mental health, are very rudimentary and not well understood in the six-sided world. What need are there of many doctors when simply memorizing a short 15-second incantation can stop somebody from dying otherwise fatal wounds? That's something anybody can do, and a humongous chunk of the population already has more physical healing and first aid capabilities than real modern doctors in the 21st century. But as mentioned before, studying in things like traditional medicine and mental health are basically thrown by the wayside at large in this world. The only thing Roxy, Elise, Geese, and Tallhand could think to do about Rudy's mental state was to drag him to a brothel and get him laid to hopefully make him feel better. It is also true that in times of grief, physical intimacy, closeness, and even sex can be very therapeutic. Does that justify doing it against his consent, however? Well, no. But there is one more argument to be taken into consideration when thinking about real-world consent and morality. Though it's not something that is one-to-one, and definitely take this with a grain of salt. Consent is not something that is purely for sex, but something involved in everything, but especially medical treatment as well. You can be injured and have an ambulance called to help you, and if you refuse to consent for them to treat you, then they can't do anything. They aren't allowed to help you. However, consent may be overwritten if the patient is unable to provide consent in a soundness of mind. For example, if they are unconscious or are otherwise in a position where they can't think straight, such as having a concussion, not fully being aware due to something like blood loss, or being in a suicidal mental state. And in situations like that, it is generally seen as okay to overwrite somebody's consent and take any action you deem necessary in pursuit of saving their life. This obviously does not fit one-to-one with the current scenario, and I'm sure people probably scoffed or stopped watching upon hearing me mention something like that, but there could absolutely be an argument that with the current understanding of mental health and suicidal depression and starvation that Rudy was going through, and that since we had already established he wasn't in a position to provide consent for sexual favors, we can also say that he wasn't in a position to provide consent for medical treatments, that there could loosely be justification for Roxy's actions from her perspective, and the other characters in the party, certainly Elise, doesn't seem to view Roxy's actions in a negative light, so this is something that could be taken into consideration. Was what Roxy did messed up despite all this? Yes, absolutely. Did the author have my weird spiel about medical consent in mind when he was writing the scene? Almost certainly not, or at least not as specifically. But does that matter? I would argue no, and that there is even a case for it in Mushoku Tensei itself. The author's intended message in a work isn't the only one that can be gleaned, and part of analyzing text is deriving meaning from it on your own. While the author's original intention matters and is important to how the story plays out, viewers and readers in any story are always encouraged to find their own meaning in the story. In episode 2 of season 1, Roxy saves Rudy from a crippling fear of people and going outside. It is not something she did on purpose. She had no idea that her actions had that kind of meaning and effects to Rudy, but that doesn't matter because Rudy got his own meaning out of what she did and decided to respect her for what she did all the same. As such, I think Mushoku Tensei itself sets a precedence for deriving meaning beyond the author's original intent, and that my medical consent spiel is justified to at least be taken into consideration. So let's go back to question 3 then. Is what Roxy did, regardless of ulterior motives, justified? You'll have to answer that yourself, but I don't think there's a clear answer. We know full well that she did have ulterior motives and wanted to be with Rudy. She even named her justifications involving saving him as an excuse, that even if she did think about all this as saving and helping him, it was probably not the biggest or main reason that she took her actions. So your answer to this question lies in whether you're somebody who believes that sometimes the ends can justify the means, or if you are somebody who thinks that the ends don't matter and the morality of the means is the only thing that counts. And I don't have that answer for you, though I do have my own opinion. But question 7, does any of this matter? I would actually argue that despite all I've said and argued so far, the answer to this question is no, for the reason of question 8. Does Rudy see himself as a victim? I think this is one of the most important things and is oft forgotten. People make mistakes and take actions that are wrong and break laws on a daily basis. However, if an issue isn't brought about it because nobody sees themselves as a victim and everybody is sound of mind and not under coercion or influence to think themselves that way, then it's okay. A common example is minors having sex. In a context where both parties are underage and cannot give consent, legally they are both breaking a law by having sex. But it is usually not an issue because neither party sees themselves as a victim, and contrarily, it is encouraged and seen as normal by most people to start exploring your sexuality even as a minor. It needs to obviously be stated that this is not a blanket statement, and there are times where a person can be manipulated into thinking of themselves not a victim, and that's not okay and a completely different thing. Statutory rape often falls into this category, though not always. For example, if the ages of the two parties were 18 and 17 and they were dating for years, that is technically statutory rape. But I think both parties would be justified in not calling themselves the victim. Rudy was not in a sound mind when Roxy came onto him. He was not in a place to give consent, nor was he mentally in a place to soundly of mind consider whether he was a victim or not. However, after a month when he was on the road traveling back home, I think it's safe to say that he was. He had fully considered the ramifications internally of his broken promise to Sylphie and informed Roxy that he was married with a kid on the way and told her something akin to romance wasn't in the cards. Though he is still going through his trauma, he is by this point thinking straight, thinking about the situation and aware enough to see the issues that are at hand. And at this point, he is no longer in a suicidal state after having an entire month to mull it over, that he comes to the conclusion himself that Roxy saved him and chooses not to see himself as a victim. As such, though morally gray, I think it best to honor the victim's wishes in this regard, since it seems to be the sentiment shared by everybody except Roxy herself, who finds herself guilt-ridden. If everybody is sound of mind and nobody is pressing charges, then on the topic of Roxy's sexual assaults, there is little issue. However, this is only one side of the issue, and we need to bring in Elena Lise, Sylphie, and polyamory into the discussion. As Elena Lise discusses explicitly in this episode, and has been brought up countless times up until this point, at least in the light novel, polyamory is widely accepted and considered normal in every part of this world except for the holy country of Milis, where monogamy is enforced by state religion. And neither Rudy nor Sylphie are followers of Milis. Sylvie explicitly stated that she doesn't mind if Rudy has other girls, and lists her lack of confidence to satisfy him sexually, and her potential difficulty of having kids due to her elf genetics as reasons. She also originally believed in the light novels upon seeing Rudy for the first time in Renoa that Elenalise was already his wife and was thinking about how she could slide herself into the mix and as a second wife herself, up until she discovered he was actually single much, much later. So question 9. Does any of that matter? Does any of what I said just matter? The answer is not one bit. None of it matters at all, and Rudy asking Roxy to be his second wife is still wrong, at least this soon. Just because polyamory is seen as normal in this world, and Sylvie herself was receptive to the idea, doesn't change the fact that how you define what's right and wrong in your relationship is up to you and your partner. This is something that Rudy understands himself and holds himself accountable for, knowing he needs to apologize to Sylvie, because after she brought up the possibility of a second partner into the mix to Rudy after they got married, he explicitly promised that she was his one and only and that he would stay monogamous for her. This is a promise that he believed at the time, and it was a promise that Sylvie took seriously and gleaned much comfort from. And that was how they defined their relationship. Nothing else in this world matters. No amount of world building about how polyamory is normal and Sylvie was receptive to the idea changes that. And Rudy knows this, which is exactly why when he brings the topic up to Sylvie, the first thing he does is prostrate himself and apologize for breaking his promise, begging for forgiveness. And regardless of the outcome of said conversation, it was a promise that he broke and was wrong for doing so, even if the sexual assault was in no way his fault. The fact that Sylvie accepts Roxy into the family and it has a happy ending is irrelevant. As happy and as glad as I am that this is the path that she took, and I do genuinely think this is probably the best option for all parties involved, she would have been totally justified in saying no, and I would have accepted that all the same. What Rudy did was something that was wrong in the context of their own rules they set for themselves. Now let's turn to Elenalise, who I believe is more in the wrong, manipulative, and worthy of ire than any other character in this situation. Of course, I don't hate Elenalise or think she's a bad person, but that doesn't mean she didn't do a bad thing, and a very bad one at that. Elenalise had rightfully agreed that she would not sleep with Rudy no matter what, even given the context of her curse that requires her to sleep with people in order to live, and his depression. And they both agreed to this and stuck to that promise. This was for the best. She inadvertently and accidentally influenced Roxy's decision to sleep with Rudy, but that's not her fault. However, what is wrong is how she aggressively pushed the idea of Rudy and Roxy marrying, even knowing about Sylvie and Rudy's agreements. She goes at length about how the Mills Church is the only place that enforces monogamy in the world, and how she believes it's not wrong to love more than one people at once. And if she had simply put the idea into Rudy's head that if he had a discussion with Sylvie about what he wants and give him the idea that being in love and having a relationship with Roxy might not be as bad as he thinks as long as he discusses it with Sylvie about the rules they set for each other, then that would be fine. I fully believe that we would even have the exact same results, and Sylvie would have agreed given her past thoughts on the matter. And this would have resulted in Rudy not breaking his promise because he would have discussed the conditions of that with Sylvie first. However, just because the results would have been the same if she did something different does not excuse the actions that she actually took, in which, after saying all this, she aggressively pushed marrying Roxy into him, argued him into a corner on the matter, and convinced him to break his word to his wife, and in the light novel even went so far as to lie and gaslight Rudy into believing Roxy was pregnant. That is not okay at all. Elenalise did something incredibly manipulative and fucked up, and could have gotten the same results in a much tamer and less manipulative approach. But she is a person who believes this to be the correct course of action, and that says a lot about her as a person. It's far from the last time she manipulates the family, hides things, and lies to Rudy either, or even the first time, as a matter of fact, in this season alone, though that won't be brought up until season 3. And yet, though I believe Alina Lise is a person who does despicable and terrible things, and that she rightfully should receive a fair amount more ire from the community than she does, I can still think of her as a good person due to the fact that she had good intentions and got good results. Because I am personally a person who personally believes that sometimes the ends do justify the means. I think similarly of Roxy and have formulated my own opinion and answer to question number 3. I'm sure many of you can guess what that answer is, given everything I've said, but that's my own personal answer on the matter, and we'll leave it at that. I do think the situation is complex and far from black and white, and personally, the only person I have ire for in how they conducted themselves in the whole affair is Alina Lise at the end of the day. However, I have chosen myself to forgive her actions of my own accord. After all, neither Rudy, Roxy, or Sylphie see themselves as victims at the end of the day, and all think highly of what Alina Lise did, so that's that. I have my own opinions on what is right and wrong in reference to her actions, but since the characters are all sound of mind and believable in their thoughts on Alina Lise in the matter, then there's no issue, and I think I can bring myself to forgive her, even if I would never condone her actions in real life. So I guess, in the end, my thoughts are that everything matters. It's important to take as much as possible into account. There is a definite right and wrong done by people, but it's okay. The characters believe it's okay, and I believe the characters would think it's okay based by their characterization, and that it wouldn't be out of character for any of them to think this way. I think there are none who think of themselves as victims, and everybody is sound of mind when deciding this for themselves, regardless of my own thoughts on the matter. So yeah, life is complicated, and there's no clear right or wrong answer. But I think that's okay, and that Mushoku Tensei has done nothing in this situation to lower my good faith in its ability to tackle complicated issues with gusto. There are no victims, so despite that everything matters, none of it matters, and it was brilliantly written, and I can't wait to see how they tackle Season 3.